All ready to go?
Yeah, ready to go.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the 8th technical meeting for the AACE Australia section for this 26th of August 2021. So I'll just go through the agenda for tonight first. I'll run through some meeting procedures. I'll give a bit of an introduction to AACE Australia section. Tonight's webinar is delay analysis, back to the basics. And our presenter will actually introduce himself and give a bit of background and then get into the presentation. At the end, we'll have some final questions to the speaker, and please use the chat function during the presentation if you want to ask questions. We probably will do a bit of a break about halfway through the presentation for questions and some feedback, but we'll leave that up to Yazeed, our speaker for tonight. We'll have some closing comments. And then at the end, we'll have some networking and an open mic session where everybody can join in and ask questions and ask things about certainly relevant to the webinar, but about other things if it's really of interest. Attendees, the meeting procedures, attendees will be muted during the presentation. Again, if you'd like to ask questions or make a comment, use the meeting chat feature. And Frank Vera, our organiser, will monitor and moderate those questions. Again, the speaker may pause during the webinar to answer questions and certainly make comments. A bit about AACE. AACE is the Association for the Advancement of Cost Engineering. It's been serving the total cost management community since 1956. And it's a wonderful organisation. It's worldwide, and it provides a very strong and powerful support to the cost engineering community. It's committed to the constructive exchange of ideas between members, development of technical guidance and quality education, the documentation within AACE and the recommended practices are something that we all as cost engineers should be embracing every day. And certainly recognition of subject matter experts. AACE, the board for Australia for 2021. Our president is Paul Harris, treasurer Yazeed Abdelhadi, and also too, if I haven't mentioned, he'll be the speaker tonight. Our website and social media coordinators, Cameron Baker. Frank Vera is our events coordinator. Keith Farrell's our publications coordinator. Michael Wallace, sponsorship and alliance, and the area chair for Victoria and Tasmania. Lewis Vidotto is myself. I'm the Vice President and the Queensland Area Chair. In West Australia, we've got Michael Anderson, our Secretary, and Alan Crowe is the rep for WA and NT. We don't have anyone in South Australia, so if someone would like to become part of the committee and part of AACE Australia, please put your hand up and communicate with any of the members of the AACE board. Positions we've got available right now: membership secretary, reporting coordinator, and training and development coordinator, and also Northern Territory. Alan Crowe's kindly filling in for Northern Territory as well. We'd like to get that region up and running also. Speaker introduction. I'm going to welcome Yazeed Abdelhadi to present tonight. Delay analysis, back to basics. Yazeed is very experienced delay analyst, and he'll give a bit of introduction to himself and certainly the topic for tonight, and then present the webinar. Yazeed will take you through some of those common delay analysis methods, and factors you should consider when selecting and implementing a delay analysis method. And certainly, as we do with every webinar we present, reference will be made back to the AACE recommended practices. So we'll make this webinar available on the AAC Australian section YouTube channel after the session. We'll also post it as a podcast on the AAC Spotify channel. This is a new initiative by our team, and I think it's going to be very, very informative and useful. And the link to the access will be shared in the follow-up email to everybody. The slideshow will be published on the AAC Australian section website. And if you want a certificate of attendance, please email, info@aace.org.au. Thank you. And without further ado, I think we will get into the presentation by Yazeed.
Thanks, Lou. Okay, I'll start by introducing myself a bit further. So my name is Yazeed Abdelhadi, and I am the current treasurer of the AAC Australian section. I'm a chartered engineer in Australia in civil engineering project management. I'm a fellow of the Chartered Institute of Arbitrators and also a member of Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors. I'm certified in planning and scheduling professional as well. I'm currently leading the delay team at Aston Consult here in Australia. Today, I'll be taking you through the delay analysis definition and what are the available industry guidelines in the market. Then I'll go through the factors affecting the selection and implementation of the methods, plus the common delay analysis methods in the industry. And at the end, I might give you some recommendations. Now, when I normally go to projects, I get asked the question of simply just, we want you to do us the impacted program. And I'm normally given a baseline and a series of events. And the expectation is I just go and find the delay impact. While this might be true in some cases, but probably delay analysis is mostly about identifying if there was actually a delay, and then identifying how much delay was caused by certain delay events. And if possible, also try to allocate that delay to the responsible party. While doing so, you would need to take account of actual progress, recovery periods, any acceleration, mitigation, or pacing arguments. So I would say it's not just an impacted program or a product of a scheduling software necessarily. So it's not necessarily a programming exercise. Before I go into the details, I'll refer to the main guidelines in the industry. I think the most extensive ones are issued by AACE International, which are recommended practices 29 and 52. 29 are revision 3 is the most extensive. It deals with retrospective delay analysis as a physical point of time. So in essence, it talks about most of the available delay analysis methods in the industry. RP 52 is specified to prospective time impact analysis, and it's less used in the industry. The other common guideline in the industry is the Society of Construction Delay and Disruption Protocol, and it's probably equally important. It's wider in terms of inclusion of stuff, so it includes disruption as well, not just delay, but it doesn't go as in depth in terms of delay analysis methodologies and the factors to consider as much as those AACE RPs. Now, the key message probably from all these guidelines is they are just guidelines. People, for some reason, just started treating those as a piece of law, or sometimes as if like it's a contract document. While they are very helpful in reducing the procedural subjectivity, but that's it. You only rely on them to decide what method to use and just make sure you are following proper practice. But eventually, it's your decision and your analysis. So you can't just refer to them and apply a certain method just because it's mentioned in those guidelines. Having said that, I'll probably try to go through the common delay analysis methods in the industry. If we go to the AACE's RP29, we find that I think there are 9 classifications of the delay analysis methods, and they go up to 15 sub-delay analysis methods. And the explanation there is quite clear and detailed. And you can see also in this extract from that RP is that they've also tried to compare them to the common names in the industry. Now, if we go to the Society of Construction Law, they simplified it further. So it doesn't contradict with what's in the AACE RPs. It just groups them into simpler versions that are more common in the industry in a way. And certainly here in Australia, it's commonly used now in delay analysis across the country. So there are 6 key delay analysis methods, which I will try to go through and explain briefly. Well, the first method I'm going to talk about takes a baseline and then takes those events and impacts them on the baseline. You get an impacted baseline program, and then you identify your delay period. And if you are interested to participate in the chat box, probably you can just try to guess what's the name of this method. Not sure if we're getting any parts. Yeah, that's right. So impact is planned, exactly. So that's the impact as planned. Probably it's the simplest and easiest method to perform. It basically requires baseline and some delay events to be modeled. Now, it has quite a number of disadvantages. It basically doesn't consider actual progress or the change in sequence, for example. And therefore, it may not be appropriate when the actual or the events has already passed or the project is actually completed. Go to this next method, and it might be less common. It starts, it calculates the critical path backward, so it starts from the end and goes backward. So it identifies the critical path through a program, and then it goes to a baseline and identifies the overall actual period of delay. And then it tries to break down that baseline into activities relevant to the identified as built program. And then it identifies the specific periodic delay or recovery periods. Would anyone like to take a guess on this? Well, using the terminology of the Society of Construction Law, that's the retrospective longest path method. Again, every method has its advantages and disadvantages. This method requires a baseline to measure the delay against, and it requires an as-built program. And that might be disadvantage if you want to see as built program as a logic-based program, which is not always available. Its key advantage possibly is that it doesn't require modeling of the delay. So you just find your as-built program, then try to match the relevant delay events rather than impact them on a program. Now, the next method is quite similar but have some differences. So this method tries to create or determine the critical path retrospectively, going backward, but it models the delay as part of that creation. So the delay event is already part of that path. So what it does, it creates the as-built program and it sees the potential other critical paths or near critical paths. And then what it does, it takes out that delay event. And here is where it identifies the delay the delay period, but for the delay event. And yeah, the comments are right. That's the collapsed as-built analysis, the but for analysis. Similarly, it requires a logic linked as-built program, and that's probably a disadvantage because it may not always be available, and it's quite time consuming to reconstruct such program. And it also requires the delay events to be modeled within that program. Now, probably the key advantage of this method is that it does not require a baseline necessarily. So it only relies on the as-built and takes out those effects of the delays and then measures the delay. So it's not necessarily measuring it against the baseline. A disadvantage here also might be that the method would not identify the switch in the critical path if there was a switch or a change, because the critical path has dynamic nature and might have moved during the project, while this method takes only the longest path and just do the analysis on that. Next method, it takes a baseline and it updates the progress up to the point where we think there is a delay event, and we check the remaining works or remaining periods after that time. In this example that I'm giving, we could identify, for example, a progress delay before we even impact the delay. And that's, for example, if it's in a project, that would be a contractor delay before impacting any event. We then use this as our new baseline. We bring a delay event and impacted it by that point of time. We get a delay estimate. And that should, for example, form our first window. We do the same thing again. We take that baseline, including the delay estimate that we created. We make a progress update up to the point where we think there is another or the next event. We see where are the remaining works. In this context, we identify that there is no progress delay, so the remaining works match the delay estimate we had in the previous window. That becomes our new baseline. We bring a delay event on that point of time. We estimate the further delay, and that's our further delay and the next window. And we continue this depending on the number of delay events we have, and we might impact a number of events in the same window depending on how many events we have. I can see some people said Windows analysis. Well, that's the difficulty with the Windows analysis. Probably there are 5 or 6 methods that can be considered as Windows analysis. So as long as you break your analysis into windows or time slices, that can be categorized as Windows analysis. Now, if we follow the Society of Construction Law terminology, that's probably called the time impact analysis method. Now, requirements, probably it requires the baseline, and it requires a series of updated programs, or at least information that can be used to create those programs. Now, it does take actual progress into account, but it still produces prospective delay or estimated delay for the period after that actual progress. So it's better than the impacted plan in a way, but it's still a version of an impacted plan that takes progress into account up to a certain point in time. Now, it can be time consuming in terms of producing programs, and if you have a number of events and you have to import progress and do the impact each time, and also may not be adequate when the project is actually completed and you know the actual periods of delay. So if it's applied, for example, it has to be carefully applied to consider the actual progress and also the actual delays if they've already occurred. I would say it's probably the most common method currently in the industry at a site level. Next method takes a baseline, similarly takes a progress update up to that point, and then checks the remaining works, and it identifies the delay period. Takes the progress update after that, further remaining works, and further delay periods. Next, similarly, and it identifies no delay in this context, for example. Now you can see it's very similar to the Windows analysis and the time impact analysis, but the key difference here is that there is no modeling of the delay. So you're not impacting delay events. You're not just checking what the programs are saying. And I'm not sure if there's anyone who tried to guess the name, but probably again, following the SCL's terminology, that's called the time slice Windows analysis. And not necessarily 100%, but generally when people talk about Windows analysis, probably that's what's meant. Now, it requires obviously a baseline to start with, and it requires a series of updated program. It's good because it identifies the switch in the critical path, and it can be performed. Sorry, it can be performed contemporaneously, and it allows you to identify the contemporaneous critical path. Its problem mainly is because if the programs are not good enough or not of good quality, it may not produce good results, and you might have to modify those programs in a way or adjust them to reflect the reality. And then this brings other questions about credibility of the analysis if you are starting to modifying those programs. I think that's the last method now. So we take a baseline and we get an as-built. We have an overall delay. So that's an actual completed project in this context. And you just measure that delay. And probably as simple as it looks, it's called as planned versus as built analysis. Now, this is different than if we take, for example, periodic parts of that as built, whether the project is completed or not, and then compare them to specific relevant activities. So breaking down that as planned, as built into windows. So this would allow us to identify the periodic delay events and recovery periods, if there are any, and also identify if there were any switches in the critical path during the project. And that would be called the as planned, as built windows analysis. Now, the key advantage of this method, and probably I would say it's probably preferred at a formal dispute level or by experts generally, because it doesn't necessarily rely or heavily rely on programming. So even if you don't have necessarily good programs or any programs, you can still rely on information you have. You can just use dates or contract documents with certain periods and stuff and use it as a baseline, and then use the as-built data to try to come up with a common sense program or set of dates that you can compare it with. Now, because it doesn't rely on programs a lot, it requires lots of justification. It's subjective and it's based on common sense mainly. So it requires more explanation and in-depth analysis of any findings. Okay, so next I'll be talking about the factors to consider the delay analysis, or when you before you select the delay analysis, or while you implement the delay analysis. And probably before I do that, Frank, is a good time to ask if there's any important question.
Yeah, so I was reading the box, the box, and one interesting question that I don't remember who asked, but it's in regards to how much acceptance there is in regards to this kind of methods in Australia. What's your experience on that?
No, my own experience, I've worked mostly in Dubai and like Dubai and the Gulf region and in Australia, and they're quite very similar. The Society of Construction Law is more common reliance on it in Australia than the AACE recommended practice, but when you look at the details, it's the same thing, just different terminologies here and there. So I think most of those methods are applicable in Australia and are used in actual court cases and arbitration cases within Australia. References are always made to both AACE Australians recommended practice and the SCL protocol. Now, as you will see at the end of this presentation, the conclusion is that it actually depends on the delay analyst's view of how he uses a method and justify it. So there's never a right or wrong answer here. It's just like there are methods with advantages and disadvantages, and you just need to judge on that. Anything else at this stage?
Yeah, no, I think, yeah, we can cover another question. Tom is also asking, you said some methods take longer than others to apply and to develop. How can, or what's your indicator to say if a method takes or not that long? Yeah, how do you analyze if method takes or not time?
I'm not sure I get the question, but one of the factors that I'm going to talk about next is the time restrictions. Now, when you talk about a method, it's just not just how you apply it, is how detailed you go into it. So for example, if you are doing Windows analysis, are your Windows daily Windows or monthly or different periodic based on delay events or and the like? So such questions would allow you to determine how long it would take to perform the analysis. Now, this factor relates to the records and type of events and the likes that would make you judge on how long it would take. Now, at the same time, you might have a budget that you have to stay with, so you can't really spend lots of time or money. There might be time constraints if it's like a formal dispute or like probably an adjudication case. You probably have 10 or 15 days only to perform the analysis. Now, it doesn't mean you have to do lower quality analysis. It just means you have to select something that is suitable and level of detail that is realistic. And if there is something that you cannot necessarily perform within this time or budget, you just have to be clear about it in your report, saying like this was done or this was not done. Anything else?
Yeah. Well, Brendan is also asking, in the case of a dispute, who determines what method should be using in there during the dispute?
Okay, well, that's very interesting because that's the key of the thing. I think the factors to consider, or like which I'm going to talk about next, are probably more important, like at least equally important to the delay analysis methods itself. Now, the selection comes from multiple places. So it could be the contract, for example. It could be if the parties, for example, agree on a certain method, there is no dispute, then everyone is happy with that method. If it's an arbitration under certain rules, maybe the rules would decide how the method is determined and would give the arbitrator, for example, the power to decide on the method. So it's a case by case scenario, and it's just a matter of considering those all factors together and just coming up to a conclusion.
Okay. Yeah, I think we can continue, Yazeed, because I think there's one more question, but it goes in relation to the quality of the schedule, which I may guess you'll mention it in future slides.
Yeah, perfect. So if it's not covered, then we just cover it at the end, no problem.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so as I said, I think the factors to consider before selecting and while implementing the analysis is equally important to the delay analysis itself. I tried to group them into 11 groups, but I know that it's impossible to come up with every potential factor to consider in a project. So it's still, each case has its own unique circumstances, but the common ones are, obviously, the first one is the contract. So the first thing I would do when I go to a project, for example, is to just read the contract documents. It's probably unlikely that the contract would tell you which method to use, although few of them does nowadays. But whether it does or not, it's just, it should give you the framework of the delay analysis. You should see what definitions are there in terms of commencement, completion, milestones, the partial completions. Now, most of the contracts, my own experience, but not all of them, would describe the way you should give a notice of delay, for example, or when you claim an EOT. And that description, even if it doesn't tell you exactly how to analyze delays or like what method to be used, it gives you that framework that you're looking for in terms of what kind of, or like the description of what analysis might be suitable. For example, I think in Australian standards, AS 4000 contracts, there are extracts there where it says when something will probably cause delay. Now, will probably indicates that a prospective delay analysis is permitted. Now, this is especially relevant when the project is ongoing, like during the project. It's reasonable to have prospective delay analysis. So when you get an instruction for additional work or a late design or late access, you have to estimate what impact you're going to have. And that's the reasonable way to think of it. Now, at the same time, if the project is completed, you will likely get a clause in the contract saying like it has to be an actual delay. Something has been actually delayed. Now, even if it doesn't do that and it only talks about a probable delay, even if you want to perform prospective delay analysis methods, you can't just ignore the facts, even if it's something that's supposed to give you an estimate of delay. If you know the actual delay and you know some actual circumstances, you have to take them into account. Now, the second factor is the time of performing the analysis, and that's probably very important. And probably most of the planners and delay analysts in the industry would know the distinction between prospective and retrospective delay analysis. And the general understanding is that prospective means you are looking into the future, while retrospective, you're looking backward. So you are, in essence, you have to check what point of time you are in. And if it's a delay that hasn't occurred yet or an impact that hasn't been identified yet, then you are estimating the delays. And by default, you are doing forward-looking analysis. You are doing prospective delay analysis. And the other way around, if the project is completed or at least that event is completed, then you're analyzing the delays retrospectively, effect and cause analysis probably. The third factor is the purpose of the analysis. Like it could be something at a site level, extension of time claim, for example. Parties will be generally aware of the main issues and the facts. So you don't necessarily have to spend great amount of time proving the actual dates, for example, or proving the event that happened, while the focus will be more in evidencing the actual impact of that event. However, if this goes to the next level and it becomes a formal dispute, for example, there'll be an expectation of full substantiation of any claim and in-depth analysis. Now, this also applies in the selection and implementation of the analysis. So you might, again, at the site level, start with a high-level analysis and only decide to go further into analysis if there is an actual dispute. So a judgment here on how much effort should I put on into the analysis. Now, the fourth factor, and this touches on what you've mentioned, the question, Frank, is what records are available and what's the quality of those records, how good they are. So obviously, as delay analysts, when we go to projects, we mainly rely on what records are available and the stories we are told by the site personnel. Now, if a method, like if an impacted as planned method is performed, it heavily relies on a baseline program. And even most of those methods rely on a baseline program. So if the baseline is not good, for example, what do we do? There's no right or wrong answer here, I think, but it has to be good enough. So you have to rely on that baseline in terms of dates and duration. And I think that's somehow fixed. That's your actual contract document, if it's an approved or an agreed or proposed to be agreed document. Now, what is not necessarily agreed and questionable is the sequence, the logic within that baseline program. And that's something you might have to test and see if it works or not. Or if there is any, for example, hard or soft logic there, something that's just because to reflect the resources that you've included there. So the message here is that when you impact a program or we use programs which you're not sure about the quality, you just have to make common sense, just professional judgment. Each time you do something, you just check the critical path, the identified delay periods. They have to make sense. If they don't make sense or they don't reflect the reality, then it's likely that the analysis will not be accepted or successful. Now, if they are too bad, for example, you would have to do something like the as planned, as built Windows analysis, for example, where it's less reliant on programs, or maybe create a program at a higher level. So you don't have to spend a great effort trying to create that detailed program, which will be less credible anyway, because it's created retrospectively. Now, it's a tough area because it's like the analysis will only be good as good as those records are, and that's what we rely on, and we have to make sure we have a solid base for our analysis. The other thing is the complexity of the dispute. So it might be technically sophisticated, so you don't, like, not anyone can do it, for example. Like generally, like the delay analyst would only be required to understand programming and delay analysis techniques, but some specific type projects require specific knowledge of those types. So like the analysts have to make a clear decision here and or disclose his abilities at that point of time early before selecting any method. And now when you select a method as well, you have to make sure if the dispute is too complex, for example, and requires multiple delay periods and multiple delay events, it might be reasonable, for example, to break it into windows. So that influences your decision to go into a window type method, and then the implementation might also have to go to break those windows into daily windows, for example, if you have daily weather events, for example. So the complexity affects also your thinking before selection and also while implementing. And that's what we touched on previously when we answered the question, is like, what are the constraints you have? Like, if I probably had no budget or time restraints, I would just review every single document and come up with the best answer. Like, I would know the reality. But you don't normally have that luxury, and it's unreasonable for you just to review all data just because you want to review it. You have to be selective, reasonable, and within time and budget constraints. And if, for example, I go to a project with a certain time frame or budget, and I know that it would take more than that to produce something reasonable, I might just decline and say it's not possible. And even if it's possible and I had to not perform certain things, I would just have to disclose that in my report, saying like, I couldn't do this because of the time constraint. Similarly, your expertise is important. So you can only perform something that you are experienced when and with. Even if you have the academic knowledge about delay analysis, for example, or how to implement things, and the practical knowledge in the application is important. And if you are coming as a third party, for example, again, the reputation of yourself or your organization plays an important role. I don't like to emphasize on softwares when we do the programming, but it is sometimes essential to have certain software knowledge to be able to analyze the delays and open the programs and see them. So in that case, you need to make sure you have all those skills when you perform the analysis. The other thing is quite obvious as well. You need to understand the entire project history, especially if you are coming to a project where something has been already done in terms of delay analysis. You don't want to repeat something that has been agreed or disagreed previously. You need to be fully aware of what has been done already. And even if you are repeating something similar, for example, you don't have to repeat it from the scratch. You can just rely on what has been prepared already, especially in terms of compilation of documents and records, which normally takes a huge time out of the delay analysis process. Probably coming from the records and complexity of the project is the delay events, like the nature of those events, the number of, like, how many events do you have, how long each event is, would also influence what method you would use and how you would implement it. Like, again, the number of windows mainly would be affected by where you put your events and how many events per window, for example. The other factor here is, as we mentioned earlier, probably every method has shortcomings and strengths point. You just need to be fully aware of each one of them to be able to make a judgment on which one is best. And in many cases, you would find that probably a hybrid of methods would be a good idea, just to cover some shortcomings. So you do a certain method and you know that it has a shortcoming in certain area, so you might just implement another method. Now, again, it's subject to considering all these factors. Do I have time to do that? Do I have the records to do that? Finally, as I've said, there are lots of variables within the projects, and it's difficult to come up with a full exhaustive list, but any other factor that includes, for example, any change in sequence, any concurrent delays, considerations, if there is any critical path definition, if the ownership of the float, for example, is an issue in the project, is there any disruption consideration in terms of delay effect? Have you checked how the program was developed in terms of calendar settings, the scheduling settings, return logic, progress override? All these things need to be considered overall and come up with a good thinking of which method to select and how to apply it. Now, because I mentioned disruption here, I think it's important to note that disruption is different than delay, and it has its own techniques. And this is an extract from the State of Construction Law protocol, where it has completely different methods for analyzing disruption. The relevance of disruption in terms of delay analysis is when disruption causes delay. So basically, if you have sometimes a loss of productivity in certain activity, activity might be extended and it might cause a critical delay to the project. Now, having said all of this, which method to use? I would say you have to consider the factors. I say there are 11 factors. The 11th one is just others. So you have to be clever and figure out what methods are, what factors to consider in your own project. Now, once you figure out those factors and thinking, you can identify your project as a project. You should be able to identify a start and finish point, usually using a baseline program. Now, you should be able to identify what's the status of your project, the actual progress, whether it started, in progress, or completed. And that would allow you to make a decision, for example, on whether it should be a prospective delay analysis. And an example here is impacted as planned. So if you have an event that happened just at the start of the project or nothing has actually happened, the impact as planned might be reasonable. You just impact the baseline as is and see what would happen. Like, you were supposed to have access on that date, no access. Each day gives you 1 day delay, for example. Similarly, if the project is ongoing and you want to do some sort of contemporaneous delay analysis, you would have to think of those methods which can give you the contemporaneous critical path. Time impact analysis might be one of them, time slice windows analysis, and even the as planned as built windows analysis, because it's done on Windows, so it can be done contemporaneously. Lastly, if the project is completed, for example, you do a retrospective delay analysis, and you have the collapsed as built and the retrospective longest path, the as planned versus as built, and the as planned as built windows analysis. Now, although I've made this categorization, it doesn't mean you cannot use any of these methods elsewhere. It's just like if you use it in other places, you have to make sure you are relying on the facts and explaining why you have done so. If I want to conclude, I would say that there is significant variance in the way methods are selected and performed. That's why you normally get two different people, experts or planners or anyone who's performing delay analysis getting different results. I don't think there is any right or wrong answer and or someone that can tell you that this method is the best method or that the one that can be used everywhere or in certain circumstances. The guidelines are very helpful, the SCL protocol and the AACE recommended practices, but they are just guidelines. They reduce the subjective the procedural subjectivity, but that's it. They rely on you to understand and apply your own knowledge on the project. Now, the essence, after all, is your reasoning and justification and presentation, and you have to include in any type of delay analysis narratives and the graphics of your analysis. And that's the key thing. It's just not just an impacted program that can be self-explanatory. There ought to be narratives that explain it. In those narratives, you have to show that you've considered all the factors and the method shortcomings. Probably a last message here is that you have to stay within the delay analysis scope. It's very easy to get out of it, trying to figure out entitlement issue. Like, we don't necessarily, as a delay analysts, figure out who's responsible for the design, for example, unless it's clear that it's mentioned that in the contract, or like there's no dispute that it's caused by the employer, for example. But if there is dispute, we have to either get instructed or assume who's responsible for it. Now, if I'm asked to give a general view of which method is most common or probably most likely to be reasonable, if it's during a project, I would say the time impact analysis. And if it's after the project, I would say it's the as planned as built windows analysis, or probably the time slice analysis. And the difference here is depends on the quality of the programs. Like the as planned as built windows analysis would be less reliant on programs. And that concludes my presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Yazeed. I think it's been very, very interesting, especially the second part where you mentioned all the factors. And I'm going to go back to one of the questions that Tom had for us. He was asking about the baseline. So as we all have seen, most of the methods required to have a baseline, and you mentioned more than once an approved baseline. What happens when we don't have this document approved?
Yeah, well, I probably apologize if I stressed on the document being approved. In my own experience, I've rarely seen an approved baseline program to rely upon. And if it's approved, then perfect, you can use it. If it's not, I think it still have the same power. You have a baseline, you have to rely on something. Now, what's that something? It's the best document you can substantiate in a way that it's your baseline. Now, that could be a tender program that you included in your contract. It could be as a program that you submitted and you got unreasonable comments back on. It could be a program that you've got from your client or like the superintendent in a way that you did not agree on at some stage. It's just something that you can substantiate that can that reflects your scope and reflects what you planned for. But you would have something generally to measure the delay against. Otherwise, what's the point of the delay analysis? Or if the records are reasonable enough, you can try to do, for example, the collapsed as built without relying on a baseline program.
Yeah, okay. I think it makes totally sense, Yazeed. Thank you for your answer. And I don't think we have another question other than just good comments. And the attendees are also asking if you will share in the slides. And in this presentation, we will not sharing the slides themselves, but we will be posting the webinar on our YouTube channel. So if you need to go back and review the information reviewed tonight, you can go there. And yeah, I think there was one last question that just popped up, said how to analyze concurrent delays caused by both parties. Yeah, I think this is a very interesting question, right? Sometimes you go to a dispute because of not getting into an agreement between two parties. Probably your experience on or your comments on how we approach that.
Well, my comment here is that it's similar to analyzing any delay events, and like the dispute over concurrent delays is very common, but for me it's the same thing. You have to analyze the factors. So normally the contract, or at least the contract, should gives you a definition of what is concurrency. It could be concurrent delay events or concurrent delay effects, or a true concurrency where you have concurrent delay events and concurrent delay effects at the same time, which is almost impossible. So that would be my first thing to understand is, what does the contract say? What is concurrency? And then it depends on the method you use in analyzing the delays. If you use an effect-based method, that would likely take out any concurrency argument, because it determines the critical path regardless of the delay events. It determines the delay periods regardless of the delay events, and then it tries to find out those events which are which have caused the delay. Now, if there are contractor claimed delays, for example, that could be linked to those determined delay periods, then that's it. Now, if there is a period of slow progress or a specific employer claimed event against the contractor in that period, then that's your concurrent delay. If you are performing a cause effect method like time impact analysis method, you would, again, it depends on the number of windows you perform, and you have to be aware of what you are expecting here. You should be able to identify immediately if there are periods which are not justified, and that's just pure progress delay by the contractor, or if there are, for example, delays caused by the impact by a certain number of days, and the delays caused by the progress are equally the same thing. So that might be your concurrent delay. Now, I don't see it as a different thing. I just see it part of the process. And if you apply your analysis properly, it's just like immediately identified as part of the analysis. I hope this answers the question.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Yazeed.
Thank you.
I'm not sure, Lou, do you have any other comment on the presentation?
Yeah.
Just to
look,
wrap
yeah,
up?
look, from me and from AACE, thank you very much, Yazeed. It was very interesting tonight. I think one thing that I've learned in particular is that I'm going to plan my projects better at the start and have better change management clauses in my contracts, so that I put people like you out of work.
Definitely agree, but it doesn't necessarily put me out of work, because like if you involve me early in the project, you would avoid the delays later. Yeah.
Yeah. Look, a good friend of mine said we should be working on on forward forensics and working out the forensics at the start and avoiding all these discussions at the end. So yeah, thank you very much, Yazeed.
If I can just add something there, is my hobby horse is that I just find that all the contracts that I've been involved in are absolutely appalling. Nobody puts very much information in the contract as to how the schedule should be presented, updated, and claimed. You know, and they say it's got the delay's got to be claimed on the critical path, but they don't say it was the contract schedule, the last updated schedule. It doesn't even say how the critical path, whether you allow multiple critical paths or not, and it's just, quite honestly, the contracts are the source, in my opinion, of all the issues that we get at the start of claims analysis. And when I get a customer contractor together, the first thing I try to get them to do is to agree on the method first. So at least they're not arguing about the method, but they're arguing about the value of the delay. And if you can get over that hurdle, then it's great. If you can't, then everybody just wastes a lot of money at the lawyers. But yeah, it's great presentation. Yazeed, it's so close to my heart. It's bleeding.
What I might suggest now is we go to open mic. I know there's a lot of questions still coming through, particularly from some people. So do you want to do that now?
Yeah, so what I'm going to do is stop sharing, to stop recording the session.